college football nerds, here to do our 2019 Michigan preview. It was actually our number one most requested preview in this offseason, and we're made you wait a little bit, but we're going to do it right now. We'll remind everybody, please subscribe and please hit that notification bell. Have had some complaints that people haven't been hearing about us or knowing that we were doing off-season content, and it's because they didn't have that notification bell hit. So, Josh, let's get into discussing Michigan football. We were real high on them last year. Surprisingly, not as high coming into the season in our Shea Patterson preview that we recorded in August and got killed by Michigan fans, but turned out to be right. And every once in a while, we do a victory lap when we're right. And we're not super smug about it, but we're little smug about it. Okay, Josh, we didn't love how the season ended, of course, but Michigan still had a great year. The revenge tour took on a pretty good part of the season, didn't finish out great, but coming into this season, I feel like there's some stability in the program. They've got their opportunity. We don't know what Ohio State's going to be, and there's some word coming out of camp that Justin Fields is maybe not the savior at quarterback that they thought, which would give Michigan an opportunity to get in there. But they lost so much, Josh, on defense. But I was talking to RJ Young. We were doing our Oklahoma discussion earlier this season, and I said to him, the goal at the end of the year is to win your games and be an elite team. You don't care how you get there. Last year for Michigan, it was that defense until the end of the season. It was that number one defense, that run stopping defense, that pass stopping defense. There's reason to believe they might take a step back, but does it matter? And lay out the scenario for me that maybe the offense can take enough steps forward that even if the defense takes a step back, in the end, they might even have a better season than last year?
Right. So you gave me a lot to unpack there, but you noted the Shea Patterson video from early last season, right? And we did get sort of torched because I went on and I talked about how I thought Shea Patterson was very talented, but I didn't think he was necessarily ready, and how he wasn't fully prepared from the spread style offense that he'd run at Ole Miss. He was used to running for his life, and he had to retrain himself from that perspective, and it was going to take him a long time to adjust to the level of play that you need to do to run a pro style offense and be consistent as a passer. I think if you go back and listen to it, everything I said, which I was just trying to be honest, I think was consistent with how the season turned out. The other thing I said in that video was that the real season for Shea Patterson was going to be 2019, not 2018. And part of the reason that we sometimes pat ourselves on the back on the show, other than being smug and trying to see the smug face of my partner Daniel on camera, is that we like to also say, yeah, we said there was a negative, but we said there was also a positive too. And the same way we said that he was going to struggle a little bit in 2018, we also knew that 2019 he was going to be able to get the offense better and he'd take a step forward. The notable thing for Michigan when they had their struggles is it was really defensively, with this weird trend they've had with Brown, where they've struggled against elite offenses, and the defense, I don't know, maybe it's simplistic, maybe the reliance on man coverage has given up points. But the offense was actually pretty consistent with what our expectations were, what our model's expectations were. One of the big stats I'll throw around, we got the Ohio State-Michigan game wrong. We thought Michigan was going to win that game, and we kind of said it would be, quote, the year. But our model was half right in that game because it had Michigan with exactly 39 points. And how many points did Michigan score against Ohio State? 39 points. The model knew exactly what the offense was going to be. And what it got shocked by was the way the defense kind of got overwhelmed. Part of that was due to injuries in the game, probably getting things out of hand. But if Michigan takes a step forward offensively, they can be better. And there's every reason to think with Shea Patterson improving, with finally having maybe a healthy Tariq Black and Donovan Peoples-Jones actually at the receiving core, to pair with Nico Collins, having maybe 4 or 5 linemen back, that's kind of a good thing, right? Every reason to think this offense is going to take a couple steps forward. And even if the defense takes a step back, they can still be elite. I mean, the defense, like Penn State, you're allowing 7 points. Rutgers, you're allowing 7 points, but it's Rutgers. Michigan State, you're allowing 7 points. It's also Michigan State. But, the defense is allowing 20 points or less in a lot of games last season. Let's say they allow 24. Let's say they allow 17 to Penn State. if they take 2 steps forward, I mean, they're scoring what, 60 points? I mean, they're going to win those games just from virtue of the offense. And when they play Ohio State, which is the real gatekeeper for Michigan's season, it's unlikely that Ohio State's probably going to generate the same sort of offensive production without Haskins that they were last year, or be able to exploit Michigan's defense in the same way. So maybe a Michigan team that takes a step back defensively, maybe even if it's a solid step back, might be better just by virtue of taking 2 steps forward offensively, and puts enough games out of reach that it's kind of a wash on one end. And then the other end, if you're already struggling enough with these elite offenses anyway, then the best cure for that is to be able to score a lot of points. Because heaven knows, Alabama, the dominant program, be all end all, they've given up a heck of a lot of points in these playoff games more often than not. And when they've won them, it's usually because they've scored 40 to 60 points themselves.
You mentioned the offense, and that's one of the places where I have it's a concern for me. It's a concern, and maybe it's only a concern because it's an unknown. But at the end of last season, we saw that the offense had shown to be a little stale, a little stagnant, kind of like the Alabama offenses that you mentioned as well, where teams get enough tape on them, they figure them out, and they just don't produce against the elite defenses the way they should. And I said at the end of last year that the best thing that Harbaugh can do for this program is to hire a real offensive coordinator, take a step back, and get his hand out of the cookie jar. Now, what does he do? He goes out and hires an up-and-comer, a great recruiter, but he hires a guy who's never called plays before. Now, I have a big critique here, and I know Michigan fans are really excited about Gaddis, and I'm not trying to rain on that parade because that's part of the unknown. We don't know if he's going to be great or not. My critique is that you're Michigan. You're Michigan coming off of a 10-win season. You don't need to reach for a question mark or an unknown. You need to go out and get, an elite offensive coordinator. And to me, I know they could have done that at the end of the year. So what it feels like to me is Harbaugh paying lip service to going out and getting an offensive coordinator, but getting a guy inexperienced enough that he can still keep his hand in the cookie jar. We saw this with Gus Malzahn for a couple of years at Auburn. He did the same exact thing. Is that what's going on at Michigan, and is there cause for concern, or am I making way too big a deal out of this?
At the end of the day, we don't really know how to read Harbaugh's mind to figure out why exactly he picked Gaddis. And there may be every reason in the interviews or what have you that he thought Gaddis was a rising star. I mean, he certainly was very successful at Penn State. He's an awesome recruiter. The receiving corps at Alabama was phenomenal. He was a great recruiter at Alabama. And they pulled in a guy with high energy that's worked in a lot of different offenses that were both very explosive and brought him into Michigan. I'm going to touch on something because there's a lot of controversy with Gaddis and Loxley. And bear with me because I'm going to spin this into a positive, but it's talked about so much, I feel like we got to touch on it. We talked about in our Alabama preview and our national championship game breakdown, Alabama got really predictable with their play calling. And in the start of the game, in the first 2 drives, they were really varied, okay? On 3 yards or less to go, Alabama threw the ball 3 times. They went 2 of 3 on those plays, 8 yards of play. Doesn't seem like a big deal, 24 yards, what have you. But when they got out of those scripted drives in that game, so after the first 2 drives of the game, every 3rd and 4th down call with less than 4 yards to go was a run, save a shovel pass at the goal line. But it's effectively a run, right? So let me repeat that stat. This was Loxley as the play caller. Every third and 4 or less to go on 3rd or 4th down was a run call, calling every play based off their script or their analysis on what is the most effective play to call in that scenario, but calling it to such a T that it made them utterly predictable and unsuccessful. And likewise, every 3rd and 4th plus was a pass, save, again, at a goal line scenario. So there's a real argument here that Gaddis had a pretty good game plan that they put together. They had play calls that identified what the weaknesses were. They had a good script that worked. But the problem is, once they got past the script and they just started getting to play calls with Alabama, there is an argument that Loxley's actual selection was so strict to the script and to what Gaddis had identified as being the successful plays that he caused them to be unsuccessful because he didn't do anything to break tendency in any way. If that's really the case, then, it may well be that Gaddis was kind of the brainchild making this work and that they were held back by the play selection from Alabama because they were basically picking the most predictable play from the plays that Gaddis had set up to be successful as the co-offensive coordinator at Alabama. So to sort of spin it around, he did have the co-offensive coordinator title for a reason. I don't think there's any doubt that there was friction between Gaddis and Loxley at this point, given the discussion. But I really treat it as an unknown, and it makes me concerned because I think it can swing either way. But I do think, my kind of line of thought here is that it's probably going to swing one way or another. Like, we're going to have a great Gaddis or we're going to have a not very good Gaddis. But I don't think you're going to get something in between. I think you're going to get a result here that's going to really show who was the brainchild of Alabama's success last year, frankly. And was Gaddis the guy that made it run, or was he the guy that maybe was holding it back?
All right, so let's dive right into the schedule and discuss, I think it's fair to talk about it as a whole. A lot of people want to go down game by game, and for me, it's more important to see where those kind of landmines are. And really, I think it opens up pretty clean because you've got Wisconsin after MTSU and Army, which Army is not a super easy game, but then Rutgers, Iowa, Illinois. I'm not super high on Penn State this year, but it's a road game. That's a tough place to play. People don't realize that Beaver Stadium is one of the toughest places to play in the country, even when they're not great. And then Notre Dame right after that. So that's one kind of spot that scares me. But for them, let's say Penn State is good and that's tough and they drop one of those games. Well, it sort of benefits them because Michigan, where this year, I think all they've got to do is win the Big Ten. Win the Big Ten with no more than one loss, and you're in. Ohio State has to play Penn State right before they play Michigan. Michigan gets Indiana right before they play Ohio State, and I think that's kind of a hidden sort of bonus for them in that they've got enough breathing room to maybe drop Notre Dame in that tough two-game stretch and play Ohio State with maybe a little bit fresher, team because they had Indiana ahead of them. Do you see it the same way if we're talking about playoff potential, that Michigan has breathing room to lose one game and make it in? Because a lot of people are going to say, well, Alabama jumped a Big Ten conference champion in one year and Oklahoma did last year or whatever. But the point in those years was that it was a team who had two losses, and it was Ohio State, and they had bad losses. So for me, a one-loss Big Ten team is probably getting in every year. But what do you think? They got room to lose one this year and still make it in?
I think so. And again, we've talked about this a million times, right? That what you do in the playoff is totally determined by what other teams do in a given year. And you got to be really careful when you look at these playoff comparison things about what Alabama did versus the Ohio State that year. And they were division winners. And then another year, Ohio State gets in when Penn State wins the division. Well, one of the common threads is if you lose two games. It also common thread is, did you lose to bad teams? Another common thread is, how good was the team that got in and what was the overall landscape? This season, when you look at everything, the SEC is probably going to get a team in. It's more likely than not. I think Clemson's probably going to get in from the ACC because there's not really anybody there that looks like they can beat them. And so they're probably going to be looking at worst one loss. And then you kind of have to look at the other two Power 5 conferences. That's the Pac-12 and the Big 12. And what do you think the odds are that the Pac-12 and the Big 12, one, that if they had a one-loss team, that it would actually get in over a one-loss Big 10 team, which I think is slim. Maybe the Big 12 could, but I think it's doubtful because there doesn't seem to be a lot of depth. I don't think a one-loss Pac-12 team's getting in. I just don't see it happening.
And they have to make sure that one of those losses isn't to the Auburn team that they play with Oregon, or the Georgia team, because if we're also including independents, the Georgia team from Notre Dame, or the Texas team from playing LSU. There's a lot of tricky situations that a one-loss team could still eliminate one of those conference champions. So I think, to your point, I think Michigan set it pretty well.
Right. So, I mean, it seems unlikely to me that a one-loss Big Ten champion isn't going to get in. I mean, it hasn't happened in the past. It didn't happen last year where you had a bevy of undefeated and one-loss teams. But it was also a very particular scenario where Ohio State just kind of, for lack of a better term, they kind of crapped the bed and lost to a really bad team.
There is a better term, but we can't say it without getting demonetized.
Fair enough. They, they got destroyed by a bad team, frankly. And that's not really acceptable when you're comparing to other conferences. One other thing I'll note when we're talking about scheduling here is, maybe their potential to beat Ohio State, because obviously your ability to beat the teams in front of you affects your record. Michigan may have a better shot this year to beat Ohio State just because of the way the matchups shake out. Last year, Ohio State had 3 incredibly fast receivers, as we saw in the NFL draft, first-round draft pick at quarterback. And we've talked about before, Dan Brown's offense, for better or worse, at this point, it's sort of a historical fact, it has struggled with elite passing attacks. Maybe there's different reasons for it. Maybe that's not Dan Brown's fault. Not the point of this video. The point is it has had issues in the past. If that's actually true, even if you buy into that theory, Ohio State now is looking at using a running quarterback. They've lost those receivers, and they've lost a lot on their offensive line. But if Ohio State is having to run an offense where they're a run-first team and they're using a run-first quarterback, maybe the scenario from Ohio State looks a lot more like 2 years ago where J.T. Barrett couldn't generate offense for Ohio State against Michigan. And now they don't have Dwayne Haskins to come in and bail them out like he did 2 years ago. So it's quite possible looking at this that, maybe Ohio State isn't really taking that big of a step back, but Ohio State looks different. And Ohio State may be a different team in a way that really benefits Michigan. So I think in some ways, even if Michigan takes a step back, Michigan may be able to win the Ohio State game just by virtue of Ohio State being a different team. And so Michigan could even be a worse team than they were last year, but Ohio State takes enough of a step back, or again, at least becomes enough of a different team that it helps Michigan overcome that hump, beat Ohio State, and come to a better record.
The thing I like about Michigan this year, I love their schedule. It's well-rounded. You got a couple of what are probably going to be at least 10-win teams on there. So, let's say Ohio State takes a step back. Well, then that means Penn State probably falls in their place, or Wisconsin falls in their place. I know it's different divisions with Wisconsin, but still, you've got an opportunity there for some other team to rise to the top. Whereas an ACC schedule, and I'm sorry, ACC fans, right now, we have historically been very positive on your conference. Right now, it's Clemson or bust. So you don't see okay, Miami sucks this year, but maybe Florida State's going to be good. No, they're not. They're going to suck. Michigan doesn't have that. And they also have Notre Dame on their schedule. So I like that it's well-rounded. Michigan fans might want to kill Ohio State this year for their schedule because they're big out-of-conference game in Cincinnati. That's not fair. They had TCU back out. But in general, I think it's good, and I think it avoids – I know they play a lot of teams coming off a bye. I don't like that stat, though, because they're playing Rutgers coming off a bye or Illinois coming off a bye, Indiana, Maryland. I don't care if you're playing Indiana coming off a bye. It doesn't matter. You should beat them. If you're playing Rutgers coming off a bye, it doesn't matter. You should beat them by 54 points if they're coming off of 6 byes. It just doesn't matter. The stretch, Penn State, Notre Dame sucks. And then I think Michigan State might be better offensively this year, but they also may not have one of the top 5 defenses in the country this year. So I'm not super high on Michigan State, which all that to say, Michigan has done everything they can to put them in a position to really make an impact this year. I have concerns that they're an elite team if they do make it into the playoffs, but I think they have an opportunity to get over the next hump and show even more progress. And part of that is what you touched on, and that's Shea Patterson. One of the things that I thought we would see last year was a continuation of a lot of interceptions, and we didn't really see much at all until the end of the season last year. But that was him trying to make things happen. He had a solid year, and I think the words coming out of camp is that he's looking even better. I think he's the kind of competitor, and I know this is kind of gut and not data driven or whatever, but he's the kind of competitor. We saw it even at Ole Miss, that he's not going to let the way that season ended sort of define his role. So he's a motivated, kind of like we talked about in our last preview, the pissed off Alabama. I like a pissed off Shea Patterson. I hope he's got the offensive line to support him. And I know I'm going to catch hell for this. Losing what Michigan lost at running back is a lot of statistical production, but I don't think they lost a lot of production in terms of we're going to see a huge drop off at the running back position. So I'm with you, man. Offense, I think they're poised to really maybe make up some slack for the defense and maybe kind of run the show for this team for a while. We just have to see how Gaddis does. So before we get into predictions real quick, you were telling me before about you're talking about losing production, about some losses of production on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe get into that a little bit and sort of unpack that before we go into picking what we think they're going to do for this season.
So, first off, I'll make the point you talked about losing production. Let's be clear, right? The running backs are really good, but none of the Michigan running backs got drafted, right? So let's sort of rein it in a little bit with talking about how good those guys are because they were really good players for Michigan. But at the end of the day, losing high-round draft picks is the thing that indicates you're going to lose production the next year. They didn't lose draft picks at the running back position last season. But moving on to the defensive point, right? You lose 4 of the top 6 leading tacklers. And moreover, not just 4 of the top 6 leading tacklers, but you're losing your top 3 leading tacklers and then another 1 in Rashawn Gary the next 3. And it's also 5 out of the top 8 when you count Brandon Watson. But, and this was the thing that kind of struck out at me, just of those 4 of the top 6 number, those 4 guys represented 135 tackles of 406 tackles in the season. A full third of the tackles made by Michigan came from those 4 players. And that may sound a little reasonable when you say, okay, well, 4 is a third of 11, but a lot of the tackles from Michigan came from second-string players and blowouts, okay? So it's really more like about 70% of the meaningful production from the team came from those 4 players in terms of tackles. That's a lot. And it's not to say that Michigan will be bad. Let me make a really big clear point here. Michigan's recruited very well. Michigan has the ability to replace losses in talent the way other elite teams do. What it means is it's an unknown. So we don't know if they're going to be able to replace that production. But, we all are kind of aware of the fact that Michigan is replacing the majority of its defense in terms of returning starters. But it's really the production. And we don't even talk about superstar status and how good the guys are to a certain extent. We're usually a little more production focused. They lose a ton of production. So it makes the defense very much an unknown. And that's why at the beginning of the video, I harped so much on the offense's ability to compensate.
So getting into predictions, I don't like this video hasn't been really, we've been kind of neutral, not positive, not negative. And it's not right now. It's not because we are high or low on Michigan. It's that there's so many unknowns. And I think that fans, and this is one of the opportunities we have because we're sort of a neutral observer here. We don't dislike Michigan. We're not Michigan fans. We just, we like college football. So looking at it dispassionately, we can say there's unknowns. If you're a fan, you're probably like penciling in the backup last year to be a superstar this year because that's what fans do. But for us, it is fair to say Gaddis is an unknown. He's never called plays before. He's done game plans before. Like you said, he's been exposed to a lot of different offenses before, which I think is great, especially at a high level. And if nothing else, he's a shot in the arm in recruiting. Michigan's been recruiting pretty well. So we'll see if, one, like you said, if the recruiting kind of fills in the gaps like we see, and that's what happens when you're a high-level program, not only wins and losses, but the fact that when you lose major production, you have recruited talent that just fits right back in there. So these 2 things are unknowns: replacing the losses on defense and an OC that's never called plays before. I think that we will have an OC that's called plays before because I think Harbaugh is going to have a hand in it. And if that's the case, I'll be disappointed because I think he needs to turn the reins over to somebody and let him run with it. But I think that sort of like LSU, where we said they are better than the sum of their parts in terms of like individual superstar firepower. I think this offense, like we opened the show with, I think this offense is going to pick up some of the defensive slack. And I'm going 11-1. I don't know which one it is. And I know that's not fair to say, but it's also August. I'm going 11-1 for Michigan. And I hope for Michigan fans' sake that it is the last game of the year that's not one of the one. But we'll see. What do you think?
11-1 is really where I lean to. And that sounds really good, but I'll be honest, the concern is 11-1 may not actually let Michigan meet their goals. And a lot of it, again, how a team's success actually translate into a record and how a team's success translates into postseason play is really dependent upon the teams around them. This year in the Big Ten, I look at a Wisconsin that has not been overly good the past year or two. There's enough teams like Rutgers or Illinois or Indiana, that Maryland I'm not going to really worry about. You should not lose to those teams if you're a very good team. The rest of the schedule, Penn State looks to take a step back this year. Michigan State can take a step forward and still not be good enough to beat Michigan. So you're really left with Notre Dame and Ohio State. And here's the rub. If Michigan goes 11-1 and they drop one of those two games, that might keep them out of the postseason. Because if they drop the Ohio State game, as long as Ohio State has only one loss, Ohio State's probably in the championship game ahead of Michigan, and then Ohio State ends up in the playoff. If Michigan loses to Notre Dame, then as long as Notre Dame finishes with only one loss, Notre Dame probably has a path ahead of Michigan into the playoff. So it's maybe you want to say it's a 50-50 chance to drop one or the other. I don't know that I'm really making it that concrete. They could lose another one as well. But it's actually really tough for Michigan in a lot of ways because they can go in 11-1 this year. We talked about at the beginning of the video, right, that what their path is to making it, and it's important not to lose to Notre Dame. But when you put the two things together, it's important not to lose to Notre Dame. It's important not to lose to Ohio State. But if you force them to go 11-1 with a loss to one or the other, you got to really hope the other team doesn't do well because it can put them in a pretty good bind.
So you've just cooked up an interesting scenario in my mind, and I want to ask you, Michigan fans, in the comments, let us know, because there's a couple scenarios here that are hypothetical, of course, but I would argue that if you gave a Michigan fan right now the opportunity, guaranteed 11-1, you beat Ohio State, and you don't make the playoffs. That's the scenario we're giving you. You go to the Rose Bowl, they take it all day, twice on Sunday. But I want to put it to you, Michigan fans. Would you rather have the option of right now 11-1, guaranteed that you don't go to the playoffs, you go to the Rose Bowl, but you get that win over Ohio State, or 11-1, might be a loss to Ohio State, but have the chance to make the playoffs at the end of the season? Tell me which one you would like more. And Josh, I think this is it for our discussion on Michigan. Thanks so much, Michigan fans, not just for making it to the end of the video, but hanging with us for the last year or so. Y'all have really come on board pretty strong. Been great in the comments. Been great on the message board. So big shout out to y'all. Thanks so much. And that's it. Thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.